Welcome to the Stanford MBA two-generational wisdom bridge across 30 years. I'm your host, Catherine Keogh McLennan from the MBA class of 1995 of Stanford. In each episode, I bring together one of my classmates, now in our 60s, give or take, and a member of the class of 2025, now in their 30s, give or take, and about to graduate into an entirely different world than we graduated in 1995. Back then, we finished our MBAs just as the internet was emerging. Today's grads are stepping into a future shaped by artificial intelligence, uncertainty, and we hope that we express possibility. These conversations bridge generations, share lessons, and spark reflections on leadership, life, and what's next. Let's dive in. Today, I'm joined by Steve Hochman from the Stanford MBA Class of 1995, one of my classmates, and Ayesha Karnik from the class of 2025. Steve started two companies selling both. His first was Lucy Activewear, a predecessor to Lululemon, which was sold to Vanity Fair Corp. He then moved into large company roles, leading new business development for a startup incubator at Intel, and later overseeing global supply chain for Nike, culminating as Nike's global VP of retail supply chain. Passionate about sustainability, Steve went on to leadership roles at Bolt Threads, creating biodegradable spider silk, and Sseko Designs, a social commerce brand supporting economic independence for young women in Uganda through the circular supply chains. Today, he consults to Global 500 clients on supply chain transformation at Nagarro Incorporated. Ayesha Karnik is a second-year MBA student at Stanford. She has worked in strategy consulting at Dahlberg Advisors and on growth strategy for Strive Health, a value-based kidney care company. Earlier, she served as a health policy research intern for the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. And now she is taking the leap to launch her own startup focused on developing an innovative blood-based cancer diagnostic test. Together, Steve and Aisha explore the evolution of entrepreneurship at Stanford across 30 years, the intersection of business, science, and social impact, and the different ways their generations are shaping industries, from sustainable supply chains to healthcare innovation. So, Aisha, where do we find you today?
I'm actually in my apartment in Munger, so right on Stanford's campus. Like Catherine said, a few weeks left before we graduate, so just coming to terms with the end.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time, and I remember one of the worst questions, if you don't have anything planned, people could ask you is, what are you going to be doing in a few months? So, Steve, where do we find you?
I am, well, if you're asking geographically, I'll answer it that way. But yeah, I'm in Hood River, Oregon, and it is spectacular outside. So there's a lot to be happy about. Perfect blue sky. And yeah, the birds are out. So life is good.
Steve is married to a another Stanford business grad, and you guys came to the Stanford Business School together.
Yes.
How many years, Steve?
Oh my gosh. So this is our 30th anniversary. Which is
Unbelievable.
It's physically
Congratulations.
impossible considering that we're 28, but yeah, it's incredible how things accelerate. I know that's a cliche, but it is certainly true.
It's so weird. It's time is a real bender. Just to note, I'm so glad to see Steve. And one of these days I want to see Juliet, his wife, because Juliet was one of my housemates, Aisha. We had 4 other women in our house at Stanford. And what about the boys?
Yeah, well, so Aisha, just a little bit of context. Yeah, we got 2 boys who are 24 and 26, which is crazy.
Whoa,
And
because
they're
you're
both out in,
28.
yeah, I know. This is just not okay. But again, we're going to stop being in denial here in a few minutes. But yeah, no, they're happy, healthy, and policy wonks in a very unusual, interesting time. I won't bore you with all of that because we're here to talk about Aisha and you. and us. But yes, they're thriving in various think tanks inside of DC and living in experiencing the turbulence that we're all experiencing in the news, but maybe even one step closer. And it's a fascinating time, different time.
Aisha, so tell us a little about what you're doing.
So, Catherine, Steve, what you saw, I was at a health tech startup right before GSB. So, joined a different startup. It was probably the most fun that I've ever had in a role. Steve, I did dabble in the policy side in college because I thought I was going to be a healthcare policy wonk and very quickly pivoted away. But so now I'm working on my own startup after graduation in the biotech space. So
Amazing.
knock on wood, and let's see how that goes. But the plan right now is we're going to try to get that going.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Is it stealth?
It's like kind of in stealth, but I don't think I'm going to be saying anything revolutionary that's going to really hurt that too much. But we're working on a new cancer diagnostic test. It's a new blood-based test. And so there are a lot of really interesting companies who've been in the space already, Grail, Guardant, et cetera, and a couple of really interesting newcomers. And so we're taking the leap to try to push into that space right now as well. I won't say too much more, but yeah, kind of the space we're in.
So who's we?
So funny enough, I think this is like something only that would ever happen at Stanford. I met my co-founder last summer. And so I was doing one of those summer startup immersion programs that Stanford and GSB offers. And I was working on something in the cancer oncology space. And I did what pretty much every other GSBer does who has no technical skills is I go to our like alumni directory and I looked up everybody that I knew that was a physician or had some expertise in the cancer space. Happened to get connected with this individual who runs a 110 oncologist practice out in Arizona. It's like the third biggest practice in the States. And he happened to be here over the summer for his summer executive program. And so we ended up meeting a few times over the summer, ended up hitting it off and just vibing really well and decided to work on this together. And so not a GSBer, but a fellow Stanford grad, which is really fun. It's a connection I would never have made otherwise. And so it's one of those really cool, unique things we talk about Stanford and just the happen chance of meeting somebody.
Now, was that always an intention over the 2 years you've been at Stanford to do that?
No, I mean, I didn't actually really want to do business school to start off with, or it was never in my life plan, which I'm sure many of us had said. My older brother who went to Wharton, and then my mentors in my last company were the ones who pushed me to do it. And then when I came here, I was that person who was like, I would never do my own startup. That's so cliche, Stanford and GSB. Within a month, you're just surrounded by all these other healthcare junkies who are riffing on ideas and talking about things outside of, for me, kidney care, which is a very niche space I was in before. The juices just got flowing. And within month one of year one, I was constantly doing brainstorming and whiteboarding with other people. And I did Startup Garage my winter quarter year one. And I was all in entrepreneur from there.
Steve, remind us what it was like in 1995 with people that were going into the startup, because you yourself have been a startup and Nike, but a lot of startups. What was it like 30 years ago? Were we doing startups?
Yeah, there was definitely, it was, the difference between 95 and 98, just those 3 years was dramatic because it was still kind of a underground operation. You had to be, even though we were embedded in Silicon Valley, a lot of folks, myself included, by the way, didn't go straight out of school into a startup. I joined Intel back when Intel was on the rise, which is in the Wall Street Journal today, if you're reading the news, is going quite the opposite direction. But fortunately, that was a long time ago. There were absolutely entrepreneurs who came straight out of school and starting things. It didn't feel quite so embedded in the culture at that point. It was more like you were surrounded by them as mentors, but there was sort of one degree of separation, maybe one extra degree of separation. That would be my general sense. So the folks who really went out and started things, I'm thinking for Kath, for example, like John Euler, who was a roommate of mine, they were there. They were truly sort of the bold and the daring, relatively speaking, to what I've seen and observed, at least from a distance, around what's going on at the GSP these days, where it's it's truly kind of part of the bloodstream, like much like the way you said it, Aisha. So it's
I
been a
was just
cultural
checking.
evolution, I think.
I was just checking my WhatsApp group messages. They made a 2025 founders WhatsApp for all of us graduating. And I just wanted to check how many members are in it. We have almost 60 people who are doing the straight out of
Yeah,
school
it's
startup
awesome.
route. No, we're not recruiting, et cetera, which I hadn't even realized it was that many.
And the sandhill type of funding was really just on the rise. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly it was a robust ecosystem of venture capital. I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to decouple to some extent. It's a good question. Like, how much of it was the sort of the stage of maturity of the ecosystem, and how much of it was Stanford and its understanding of its role in that ecosystem? Like, I felt like it was more that it was mature and evolved, but the people who went there were like Steve Jurvetson, right, who went straight into venture capital. There was always like one step removed from the sort of the all-in entrepreneurial risk where you dive off the deep end and you raise money. It didn't seem like that was as common a path. And whereas the Sandhill Road was there, like, I mean, it existed, obviously not to the same extent and the same scale, but there was a Kleiner Perkins, et cetera. They were all there, some of the big ones, Ben Rock, they existed when we were there.
How much is available at the business school to learn? Now, Steve, we had a few venture capital learning type of lessons, but Aisha, tell us a little bit. I mean, you throw out a word called garage.
There are courses that we have, so experiential, immersive classes that you can take and you get credit for. So the ones that I think people know the most at this point are Startup Garage and Lean Launchpad. Startup Garage is typically any sort of business model you might have, and especially more kind of services oriented, some product. People go through Startup Garage. And then you have obviously the summer opportunities. So while a lot of my friends were going out and getting formal internships, I applied to a program through Stanford, and there are two different ones that GSBers will typically apply to, both the Chan and IDIF. And they basically will pay you a stipend so that you can work from
Oh,
home or work from wherever in, Palo Alto or remote,
that's
and just
huge.
work on your startup for, 12 weeks to the full summer. And so that's what I ended up doing. And I just basically had a stipend to go heads down on startup stuff. And then you just have, access to professors. Catherine, Steve, you guys are talking about it. The VC ecosystem has always been rich, but I think the connection with Stanford has gotten so much richer. All of I would say my favorite classes are taught by professors who are connected or in the VC world. Scott Brady at Innovation Endeavors, Rob Siegel, who was also a
Oh,
GSB
yeah.
alum. Yeah, I don't know
He was
when.
like a class or two ahead of us, I think. Yeah.
I love Rob Siegel. He's probably one of, if not my favorite professor. But we're taking all these classes with them, and it's learning term sheets, learning what the investors are going to try to do to you when you're negotiating term sheets, and how, as a founder, you should be, watching out for pitfalls. It's every week we have guest speakers who come in who are founders themselves. A lot of them GSB alum, and so you can see the path they took and how there's 100 different ways you can still get to being a founder. And I think that, to me, is actually what's been the most exciting part. I think Stanford and the GSB has broken this myth that there's one way to be a founder, and that you have to be that aha lightning person who's sitting on their couch just like thinking of ideas constantly. And I think that, to me, has just been the best part about being here.
Yeah.
Steve, if you go back to Intel, the CEO, Andy Groves, was definitely part of our Stanford.
Yeah. He was why I joined.
Oh, it's
Yeah, and
amazing.
he was a really charismatic
Oh, yeah.
CEO, but Steve, you stayed at Intel for that long. But what happened after that? What pulled you away from Intel?
So I did. Part A was getting pulled in because of Andy co-teaching the class with Professor Bergelman, who I don't believe is he still teaching there? I don't believe so. I'm pardon my ignorance, but anyway, amazing high-tech strategy class, and as Kath said, very charismatic, and also at a really interesting juncture in the company's history when the company could, I wouldn't say do no wrong, because in fact there was a major defect in the chip design at the time that I was in the high tech strategy class, and Andy Grove was puzzling out loud about how to address it in the public markets. And so it was fraught with turbulence, but still the company was on a very steep upward trajectory, really cool, innovative place to be at the time. So that's why I joined. Part two was, though, the group that I joined, which is in Oregon, which is how I ended up in Oregon, was it was a real incubator startup group. So this was my foray in a low risk way, just like Aisha, you were talking about, is like my paid internship was inside of Intel that was trying to incubate new businesses that would create demand for processing power. Because the big concern at the time was that we were running out of applications. Who knew, right? That would never be a problem again. But running out of applications to create demand for processors. And so we were trying to create new applications. And so very startup-y incubation type organization up in Oregon called the New Business Group. And that is maybe the middle length answer to your question, Kath, because it was at that time, a few years in, that it was also the beginning of the first dot-com boom. So everybody wanted to be the Amazon of everything, right? And it was also very easy at that moment to literally drive up and down Route 101 with a PowerPoint presentation and no experience and raise money. And so we did. So,
Within Intel, Steve. So you didn't go always to the markets, or you?
No, in this particular case, so I left Intel having incubated a few businesses at Intel, and then I met through. This is a long-winded answer, but just so you have the context, um, through Juliet, my wife at the time, just recently married, who was at Nike. I met the women's brand director at Nike who was looking to serve an unmet need that wasn't being met by Nike. And so we co-founded, because I just enjoyed starting stuff at that point, and was able to raise the money on Route 101 from some Silicon Valley venture investors, a women's activewear brand. I knew nothing about the topic other than that my wife was an athlete, and I knew how to put together a business plan, or at least I thought I did. And so just a convergence of luck and some amount of preparation, but a lot of luck around the timing, right? So it was, like I said, it was easy at that moment to have limited experience and still be able to raise the cash to get going. So we started this company. It was called Lucy Activewear. And so that's how I kind of de-risked, if you will, the journey that you're taking now, Aisha, is by sort of taking those stair-step moves towards entrepreneurship.
You were at Washington in that policy role, and that's an interesting shift, right?
I think the initial interest started off actually back in high school. I was one of those kids in the debate team. And so for 4 years of my life, everything was policy and current events. And, that was my world. And so I came out of that, also wanted to be pre-med when I went to college. And obviously that's not the path that I stuck to. And so I always kind of had those two threads at the back of my head of, I love medicine. I love that space. And I really like the kind of the policy side of it. And so when I was in college, there was kind of a program that we were able to do where we could intern in DC while taking classes with some of our professors from the University of Texas kind of system out in DC. And so there was like this hybrid internship classes semester that I had. And so while we were there, the whole point is to do an internship that was actually at a policy division or organization. And so that's where I did my health policy internship at the Council of Economic Advisors. And I think there's so much value for what people do and are working on the policy side of things. I think the pace is just not for me. There is a lot of red tape, so many steps that have to happen. And you could be in a room where everybody agrees on what needs to move forward, but it won't be 4 months until that move forward actually happens. For a variety of reasons. And so I think for me, I just know myself, probably one of my worst traits is I'm a very impatient person and I like to see results pretty quickly. And so pivoted away from the policy side, and then thought that maybe the pivot was, let's go work in consulting, but on the social impact side of things, which is why I went to Dahlberg. And I was like, okay, it's kind of the hybrid of public-private sector now in this role. Again, loved it. A little bit slower pace again for what I think I needed. And just a different, I think, just level of resourcing in some of those organizations. They're doing amazing work, but it's just, there's always going to be a little bit of a limit on, and I think, the sheer impact. And so really thought, okay, private sector, if I'm working on something impactful, I think we can make a lot of kind of growth and reach. And so I ended up joining a startup, which is really nimble, really agile, really working on something that was kind of personal to me. And that's when I got sucked into, you can still have impact through the private sector world. It's just a different route, but there's a lot of resources that are backing you.
And Steve, if you go back to, I know you were always looking for companies that had social impact. Tell us a little bit about that philosophy as you were looking for opportunities.
Some combination of DNA and experience, I guess, that kind of kept pushing me back to purpose as a thing, and making and calling it out explicitly rather than implicitly. It just was part of how I showed up to work in the very beginning. Before I joined business, or before I came to business school, I worked at Bain and Company, which didn't necessarily check that box. But between the two, between Bain and Stanford, I worked for an environmental policy and environmental advisory firm well before the word sustainability was even in the vocabulary of a lot of organizations. And I think the DNA part is just, I'm a nature boy. I mean, it's just, I was that kid. So that, if you take that as kind of the sort of the baseline, I found myself, again, we all ask the question, right? Like, what's my source of energy? And so for me, that was a key part of it. And so, yeah, I carried it forward without necessarily thinking it had to be the environmentalism thing. It was just the notion of, the Steve Jobs, the cliche of, leave a ding in the universe. That has always motivated me. And so that was in the form of creating opportunities for women in sport because of the background that Kath just described for Juliet and my respect for that. But it still was a thread of sustainability. And so long story short on that front is I found a niche from an industry perspective that I could hang my hat on in apparel footwear and functionally speaking in operations. The cool thing about the operations piece is that it affords you an opportunity to move the needle on sustainability, because if you can reduce waste in the supply chain, then you can do all sorts of amazing things for the planet. And another part of being a serial entrepreneur is that you it's a portfolio play, because sometimes you have the aspiration and the vision and you're ahead of the curve, too far ahead. And I had some of those. And then others where, even at Nike, I was able to find enough critical mass and support for the things that I wanted to do, in addition to the day job of actually delivering profit and loss for the company, mostly profit. There was really an opportunity to innovate both in large companies and in some small startups after Nike. So yeah, I think it probably, to reflect on the answer in real time, Kath, I think part A of the answer is, I just kept looking for opportunities to fit it into, another role that I knew would have enough stability so that I could stick with that purpose, knowing that there was some critical mass of financial stability behind it. And whether that was venture capital or, a large company. The other side, go ahead. Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I think the other thing is, though, with that comes some risk. Just to be clear, like, it's enough part of who I am that sometimes I'll take risks that won't necessarily be wise if you just look at them through the lens of finances, because it's just too important to me to have that kind of impact. So anyway, that means that my career has been, it's been great, but I've also had huge ups and downs along the way. It's not a straight line by any stretch.
If you say risk and impact, what do you mean by that, Steve?
So, if take as a given sustainability, right? I'll give you an example, right? So Nike, I had 10-year run, amazing company, loved it. And it is itself it's very supportive of entrepreneurs. It is a just do it, that actually means something. It is that kind of culture and company. So I could have stayed there forever, right? And that would have been the low risk move. And things were going great, and sort of up and to the right, right? But my impatience around moving the needle on sustainability meant that I didn't stay. So I was recruited into an organization after 10 years that was well funded from a venture capital perspective, focusing on sustainable materials in the apparel business. And the company was developing out of Silicon Valley biomaterials, so it was genetically engineered spider silk without spiders to make apparel. Really cool stuff. And the company still exists, but barely. Right. So I was the COO, and we thought we were going to scale. The scientific breakthrough had happened, and it truly is revolutionary. But the difference between scientific breakthrough and scalable process is vast, right? It's that lesson that continues to need to be relearned. So when I say risk, it was that, right? Like I had a salary, right? But I was there for a little shy of 2 years, and we just realized it wasn't going to scale. And it wasn't a supply chain problem, which was my expertise. It was a science problem.
Aisha, that's a
That's
great opening for
yeah.
you because you're all science, right? And so, what is the role of startup business and science discovery for you?
Pure business, pure strategy. The company was more of a care model services company. So we were deploying nurses, practitioners into models. For anybody who's familiar with kind of the Oak Street One Medical model, that is what we were, but for kidney care. Just by nature of GSB and meeting different people and different conversations, I just got interested in this biotech space and slightly more the science forward side of things. And so this, to your point, Kath, is a very, very different path. And I think exactly it's what Steve is saying. When I sit here thinking about the next 6 to 9 months, I don't think the thing in the back of my head is, oh my gosh, this may not happen because I don't want it to happen. It's the science may not connect in the way we need it to connect in order for it to happen. Or even if the science does connect in the way, there are 12 steps after that to actually get it commercialized and in market. And anybody who knows healthcare knows that regulation is really hard to get through. And so I think to me, the startup plus the science side, at least in the healthcare space and biotech, is really fascinating because so much of the innovation happens there, but there's almost a behemoth of work and kind of barriers you have to get through after just the initial science that in some ways the breakthroughs aren't enough to actually make a company always. And so I think that's the tension that we're thinking through right now of what are all the things that we could be doing today to start de-risking all of those processes we're going to have to go through in 6 months should we get the signals that we want to be getting.
But have you discovered then something that already exists in the science? Is it something that you saw and you said this has a goer and people aren't in the market, and so therefore I'm going to support the science, but here's the path?
I would say I think it's a bit of a mix. So there have been players in this space for decades, if not more. I don't think, early diagnosis of cancer is necessarily a new space or we're creating a new market. I think the approach to it has been slightly different than what we're going to be looking at doing, hopefully in the next 6 to 9 months. I guess without looking away too many details, I think there is science out there that at least gives us confidence that this should work. And we've seen it in the research that this works. I think the actual application of that particular type of research in this field in particular hasn't actually connected yet. There's a little bit of newer science that we're trying to bring into the space that hasn't fully been here before.
And so here you are bringing together the business, the regulatory scene, the science, and and by the way, competition, and you're trying to put all those pieces together. I don't think many minds could handle that.
And I think it's so funny because we were just talking about Rob Siegel before. I mean, he teaches a class now called Systems Leadership, and it's literally all about this. He has a book that he's released all about it. And I think it's so core to what we've been learning in all of our classes of if you are working in silo as the business person or the biology person, you're never going to be able to do what needs to be done for the strategy. And so I think about like all of our project management kind of boards that we have, and I probably have 13 different columns because one's, regulation FDA, one is reimbursement payer and what does our actual payment mechanism look like? One is how do we get providers to want to use this? One is how do we market to patients? Like there are just so many complex actors. And I think if you're not thinking about it as a system, especially in healthcare, Steve, especially in sustainability, there's just, I don't think there's really a path to success there.
And that's the competitive edge, Aisha. I was a little bit in biotech in my summer I worked for Amgen before Amgen was famous. But back to Steve, your supply chain expertise, how did you take that on in the next step?
The gap it's interesting, right? Because we're talking a lot about systems and fusion, right? So was a combination of supply chain and science. Like you couldn't decouple them. It was like just to not to get too wonky on you, but like this, it's very relevant to I think what Aisha's talking about, right? There's science and then there's science. Like it applies at different stages in that journey, that 13 steps that you're describing. So like the first is laboratory, right? I had nothing to do with that, and I could, I could wear a lab coat, and that would be the end of it. But there's like another stage where science is still involved, where you're trying to figure out how do you make a process, in this case, spinning silk reliably, that's still very much science based, convert to something that is a production facility, supply chain, right? That can then generate millions of units of this stuff. So anyway, that was the breakdown. That's what didn't work, is the handoff between the two. And so that's backwards looking. What I did after that was just double down on the knowledge that I had and the network that I had to identify what next. So this is more of the classic serial entrepreneur strategy, where it was clear that wasn't going to happen. Just we had money, but it was going to take an extra 5 years that the company wasn't going to spend on a COO, which was my role. So I ended up joining and leading an organization that was trying to figure out small retail purpose-led apparel company that was trying to figure out how to create a opportunity again for women in the manufacturing locations where the product is sold. So both in Africa and in Asia, and with me coming on board, how to close the loop on waste in a traditional apparel retail supply chain. So thinking about circular supply chain. So I actually ran that company for a couple of years before we sold it. So that's where I went next. It was not, in this case, I stepped away from the science, right? This became much more of an engineering problem in this company. But yeah, so the thread was still there, so to speak, in terms of purpose, but kind of classic case of demonstrate agility because you have to. And when one venture doesn't work, you reinvent, and still, of course, leverage the knowledge that I had. And so that was the sort of the next step.
Truly amazing, Aisha. And how many people at Stanford now are involved in the healthcare segment? Because, Steve, I don't think many of us were getting into either the policy or the research. I mean, it was fascinating for me to go and work at Amgen, but even Amgen, Genentech at that time, were still the outliers in terms of startup. Biotech was just starting, Aisha. So healthcare now in your class, in your interest, we're all watching it in terms of especially the US model. How many people, how does that get looked at Stanford?
What I find interesting is I would still say within the GSB, it still feels like a pretty small number relative to the size of the industry. So I was literally just going back to our What's Up again to refer to it. I think in our class, there's maybe 40, 50 people who are very focused on healthcare, which is definitely, it's a big chunk of it. But I think that doesn't necessarily translate to the GSB ecosystem around us. So when I think about the number of classes that are offered that are more focused on healthcare, very few. And so for a lot of us, we actually take, well, I'm sure you guys use the same term, the across the street classes to go to the med school or primarily the med school to take any sort of healthcare specific classes. Healthcare innovation, there were biotech classes we took. There's AI innovation in healthcare. And a lot of those courses are offered not in the GSB. And I think in the past couple of years, there's been a much bigger movement of creating cross-school collaborations. So there's now a Stanford Healthcare Innovation Club that is across school. So engineering school, med school, GSB, that's trying to bring together healthcare folks. Because I think if you look at it in each individual school, the offering may not be nearly as large apart from the med school, of course. And so I think that's something that a lot of the healthcare folks in our class have been struggling with and or trying to remedy a little bit is how do we build a community around healthcare when there may not be as much of that healthcare focus in the GSB curriculum or course offering or whatever that is.
But 40 to 50 people, that's a lot, Steve.
As comparatively, I think, Catherine, to your point, it was maybe 10% of that.
Steve, when you're talking about the supply chain and getting women up in the various countries. How do you decide at the time you go in, Steve, which countries, how do you find the information? Because you guys are just inundated with information, Aisha, in this generation. What was it like then, Steve, in the company that you just introduced, where you decide to really support women and you find the countries overseas? How do you do that?
Yeah. Well, triangulation is kind of the fancy term, right? You're looking at all these factors that you consider. And one of those, because we were driven by that particular mission, was a filter, right? So you think about it, like one filter was just where are there so-called fair trade certified manufacturers, and that starts to shrink the list pretty quickly. And there are some associations even that manage some, that are like syndicates that manage some of that information and those networks. So there's that. But then there's also capability and skill set, and that is harder to discern through just like a website. And there you're just it's again personal networks. I keep coming back to that, but it's so much of it is who do you know that knows someone that can allow you using 6 degrees of separation to find that right partner. And then the third part is still honestly, and this is part of the entrepreneurship thing. It applies in supply chain as well as in technology. Is just trial and error and experimentation. And so trying to create that laboratory environment where you've got like a few suppliers competing for the business and one of them is going to work and one's not. So you sometimes just have to learn by doing.
Is it
Yeah.
women-led companies or?
That was the network. That was very much so the origin story of the company that predated me. I came in to run it after it had been established. There was a woman who had that as her sole life mission beyond business. And she started a factory to try to create opportunity for women, young women in particular, in Uganda. Long story as to how she ended up there. Again, some personal connections. So that was truly a one-on-one connection done at the true grassroots level where she basically parachuted herself in and said, speaking of risk, I'm just going to start this. And so it was literally like making sandals and teaching girls how to make sandals in this one village outside of Kampala, the capital of Uganda. And then it was networking from there that led to partners that were like-minded in Uganda, but also in India in particular, and even though we don't associate China with that kind of like social purpose-oriented attitude towards industry, there are some real social entrepreneurs in places you wouldn't expect to see. So we had some in China as well.
And I also worked for a company, Cochlear, which you guys call Cochlear. And so the regulatory that you're talking about that happens all over the world, do you research at this point?
Yeah, it's something that we've been taking a look at. I've talked to a few other folks who've done their own share of biotech startups in the past and in their experience. And I've actually had conversations with them of, did you ever consider trying out your technology in a different country where regulation may not be as interconnected, complex, et cetera, as the FDA, but you would still get a stamp of approval that the technology works, it's vetted, you can definitely deploy it out into market with different populations. So I will still, I think right now we're still focusing on the US. I think both me and my co-founder, who's a physician, like we're very familiar with the FDA. It's probably the closest regulatory system that we're used to. But we have been actively researching, are there other environments or health systems that might be for many reasons advantageous to go look at as a primary market, if we think the science to actual market steps are too robust here.
In this crazy environment that the US is creating, what are you seeing in terms of the supply chain impact?
Well, of course, we don't know what's going to happen. And that's that much we know. But the gist of it is that the world of uncertainty is the answer. Like how you handle uncertainty is how you're going to manage supply chain. So it's all about scenarios. It's all about options. Portfolio theory applied to finance, but applied to supply chain, right? You just have to be ready to pivot. And of course, unlike dollars flowing through with electrons across the digital infrastructure, you have physical things you got to build, right? And you have capabilities and skills. So it's not as simple. And therefore, the risks and the costs of failure are higher, right, than you would have in, say, just bits and bytes. And so, yeah, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, we don't know, but what we do know is that those who will win are going to be those who are able to pivot better while still having a stable capability at the core, right? So it's that ambidexterity, if you will, that is going to be the sort of the muscle that is defined, I think, defines the next 5 years. Whereas before, historically, it was about efficiency, reliability. COVID was kind of our first test for agility, right? Kind of a global level. And now we're in it's a kind of a COVID 2.0 sort of experience, but self-inflicted in this case.
Is there any possibility in your industry, in your specialization, to even do that? Like, is the US ever going to be able to manufacture?
How much time you guys got? No. Yeah. Yeah, I know. So there will be a movement. There has been movement prior to this current administration towards U.S. manufacturing in certain areas because of other benefits, like closer to market for the U.S. market, or like in to Aisha's description of, like, if you're talking about pharmaceuticals, sometimes having a relationship with the regulators, et cetera, as you know better than I, those things merit having a supply chain close to market. There's many reasons. So that's the good news. But no, I mean, honestly, I don't know if I can. I guess I can say this word on podcast. The Chinese are kicking our ass when it comes to manufacturing, broadly speaking, and that's not just apparel, footwear. It's like I actually advise companies across sectors in supply chain in my current incarnation, and whether you're talking pharma, whether you're talking heavy industry, automotive, Chinese are running circles around us. So Tom Friedman, yes, like that's kind of, I see the same thing. And number one, number two, the skill sets required, the education system. So this is why I'm trying to keep it short. But I could go on about the gaps that we have in educating our workers to be able to capitalize on the new ways of manufacturing. It's not screwing screws into iPhones manually. It's robotics, right? And it's managing digital systems that manage robots, and so et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have major work cut out for us. And then finally, the economics, even when you do all of that, may still compete against us for the labor content that's remains for certain areas where you can't automate. So China labor rates are more expensive than Southeast Asia, but they're still 1/4 of what they are in the US, right? So all of those factors are huge hills to climb, and tariffs are not. I'm trying to be apolitical here, but they're not going to get us there.
When we say very naively that China is a copycat, no, it's not. It's not a copycat.
That's intense hubris.
It's intense hubris. And so we're back to Sputnik back in the 60s, when we're like, oh my God, we better get our aeronautical engineering quickly, or Russia involved. Okay, so Aisha, back to Stanford then. How much exposure are you getting to that international view?
I think in a variety of channels, not so we have some courses. Keith Hennessy, for example, has so many classes like policy time, US China, where we do have very dedicated courses to talking about issues like this. Funny enough, the travel in some ways actually does lend itself to that. So we had a group of students in our class who are from Saudi Arabia, and they planned a trek. So we did a trek to Saudi Arabia over winter break. We have some of our Chinese classmates who set up 2 different treks to China and Tibet over spring break. And so there's, I think, options and opportunities in that way to be able to go see and experience a lot of these different cultures firsthand that I don't think we always necessarily would have gotten the chance to otherwise. And then I think it's just, you guys know this, Stanford GSB students are curious. We always have opinions, sometimes too strong of opinions, but we have them. And I think just talking with classmates, every time there's a new news article that comes out, the buzz is around campus and everyone's talking about it. And we try to also, whenever we bring in speakers, in a polite way, but we'll try to ask them about some of these geopolitical issues and how it's affecting the companies they're running or the way they're thinking about their long-term strategies. So I think there's a lot of different vantage points through which we're able to plug into what's happening in the global ecosystem, which is keeping us kind of up to tabs on that.
Steve, are you a regular traveler?
Yeah, so I've spent a fair amount of time in Asia. Partly, I mean, even back to Nike days, it was very much part of the job description to spend a bunch of time with our factories, and then sort of informally through the client network that I now have. So yes, a lot. And Europe, Asia, yeah, across most places. I haven't spent much time in Africa and South America, but I mean, that's not because we shouldn't. It's more just it's the next thing on the map to some extent, from my perspective, that we're now discovering needs similar cultural understanding that we didn't have when Asia was the new kid on the block.
Which makes a lot of sense. Hey, here's a question, Aisha. If you had to pick a country instead of the US where you are going to do your business or start your business, would there be a second choice somewhere that would be easier?
I think what makes it a little bit hard to even answer that is even in the US, FDA healthcare regulation over the past, let's just say 6 months, has changed so much and is constantly changing that my co-founder and I are going back and forth every time there's a new regulatory announcement of, wait, is this good for us or is this potentially going to make it harder? And so there's almost uncertainty whether or not in some ways the US might actually be becoming now easier for us to handle some of the regulatory side. But assuming it's as difficult as the FDA tends to be. I mean, places that we've looked at, honestly, are, Canada, UK, where they're very similar in terms of pharmaceutical, medical research, science cultures. But with their national healthcare system, I think enables some optionality for wider kind of distribution than what you would get in the US. Here, it's very much dependent on individual payers that you have contracts with, maybe Medicare, but largely payers. In those countries where there is a national system, there's one payer, there's one buyer, there's one distributor. And so those are kind of options that we've been considering. But I think in the next few months, it's still to be determined depending on what happens with the FDA.
So what has changed mostly in the last 6 months with the FDA?
There are just certain approval processes specifically for medical devices and new technologies through the drug approval and medical device approval pathways that there has been discussion on whether or not easing up certain parts of those pathways and tightening up other parts of those pathways. Some fun balancing acts that are happening right now. But there are a couple of those specific approval processes and applications that might be applicable to what we're doing that might be falling in the bucket of they're trying to find ways to accelerate approval for. And so there might be a tailwind for us potentially to be catching right now, but we're still in that mode of discussion, proposals, waiting for approval of some of these kind of regulatory shifts to happen that we're a little bit sitting on the edge of our seat here.
Steve, you're now consulting with a lot of supply chain businesses. Is that right?
Manufacturing business, Nike is a client, Honeywell, General Motors, all those guys.
What do they come and ask you to do? What's their biggest challenge?
Well, like the question you asked around sourcing and source location, and how do we create? I'll use the word agility to simplify. How do we adapt to what we're seeing, and what does the future hold? So it's both backward looking and forward looking, and so we're advising based on trends that we see. We're constantly immersed in the data to see what people are doing, not only in terms of investment in locations, but also in skills and in technology to enable that kind of ambidexterity.
If you think about it, 1995, when we graduated,
Yes.
the internet was just coming alive. And when we did enter, in my argument, the information age, and we were
Dinosaurs
challenged.
were walking the earth.
Yeah, like that. When humans were just walking the earth. And the big challenge for the information age was big data. If we're entering this new age, how does AI then play a role in the search of where businesses can go and the data you need to decide that? Does AI help you with that?
I think AI has been honestly huge for it. I mean, if I consider myself in the way that we've been approaching some of the pieces of startup, I mean, a few things. One, if we think about, the 13 columns that I'm trying to ramp up on and make sure I understand, not, especially in healthcare, not everything is available easily for you to get information of. And somehow ChatGPT, Perplexity, they've become my best friends of understanding how do these regulatory processes work? What are the individual steps I need to be looking into? How can I, Steve, to your point, start scenario playing with a few of these different announcements that we keep getting. So in terms of just knowledge ramp up and acceleration, it is massive for kind of the given startup you're working on or the field you're in. And then I think it's also just big for exploring what other opportunities or options are out there. So for us, we've been thinking about what is the best way to take our technology to market. And there are some pretty standard ways you can think about business models for biotech. And I, a week ago, just did a simple question to ChatGPT of saying, hey, can we just think about our company, not as a biotech company, but as a SaaS licensing company? Can you help brainstorm with me what are ways to think about applying other business models to what we're doing? And I had like a full 45-minute, conversation, whatever you want to call it, with ChatGPT. And I'm literally about to have a conversation with my co-founder later this week about how can we start thinking about blending some of these models that previously we thought were in two different universes. And I don't think, at least for me, where I'm sitting when you're so heads down working on a startup, it helps bring you back a little bit to the big picture and pulling in insights and threads from other industries and other models that I think has been, at least for me personally, just transformative. I think there's a double-edged sword that a lot of our classmates have been talking about this era that we're in right now as we're using AI for our learning capacity at the GSB. As you can imagine, just the many places ChatGPT is showing up through classes. But I think the double-edged sword that we've thought about is for kids who didn't kind of have the foundation of learning like we did, does things like ChatGPT almost create a crutch that they don't know how to learn? The reason why I know to ask about applying SaaS models to the business models we're in is because I grew up in an age where for every research paper, we had to have a bibliography with 18 sources from physical textbooks or actual articles or publications online. And so if ChatGPT gives me an answer that I'm not satisfied with, I have this back of my mind intuition to question that and to ask for refinement and to ask for, okay, that's helpful, but give me this other angle because I have tidbits of information that I've just stored at the back of my mind. And so something we've been thinking about is I think ChatGPT opens up so much for the potential for kids learning. And if you're able to feed it the right questions, I think the universe is just infinite. But it is, how do you still instill a level of the right way to learn, the right way to prompt ChatGPT with the right questions? Because ChatGPT can give you any answer out there. It's whether or not it's giving you the answers that are actually to push your thinking and push whatever innovation that you're working with.
Steve. All right. So we are all nearing 60. Some of us are a little over 60. If we had to give advice on anything, I mean, we can't give you advice on ChatGPT or, the regulatory and how healthcare is going to change. If we imagine ourselves, Steve, when we're just about to graduate, if there was one thing like I would have liked to know if anybody could have told me.
I'm all ears.
Maybe that would have been the thing. Listen.
Exactly.
Joking aside, I think it's for the first part of our lives at that point, like it was our entire lives, we were rewarded for being the smartest kid in the room or seeking acclaim for that intelligence. And it's ironic, but the conversation around ChatGPT and you said it, Kath, around like asking the right question. I wish I had spent more time thinking about how to ask the right question versus coming up with the answer. And that's still a learning for me. Like I'm still working on that. But if I could go back in time, I would have made that an explicit expectation of myself.
I love that. And there's so many forms of wisdom that I just didn't appreciate, Steve, when I graduated. Aisha, as we come to a close, I'm so excited and delighted that the minds like yours are coming into that. What else are you most excited about as you come to a close at Stanford?
Probably the cliche answer, but I'm honestly just so excited for the next 7 weeks to spend time with friends here on campus in Palo Alto. You guys experienced it. The first year and a half went by so quickly. in a lot of ways, I call the GSB really a one-year program because the first year you're trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And even though you think you knew what was going on, by second year, you look back and you're like, wow, Aisha really had no idea what was happening. So I think the next 7 weeks or 6 weeks that we have left, all of my friends have talked about, we just want to slow down and just enjoy it and actually be here. To your point, Kath, we are doing all the travels. We're always gone. We're running at 100 miles per hour, but I think we're just missing a lot with that. And so I'm excited just to be with it.
Aisha, that is the generation's challenge. And I'm so excited for you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. For more insights and information, visit my website at katherinemclennan.com. That's spelled KATHARINEMCLENNAN.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the series so you know when the next episode will be as we continue exchanging wisdom, connecting past, present, and future through the perspectives of Stanford MBA graduates of 1995 and 2025.